Oh, that's right. DM and the PM, baby.
What's going on, guys, and welcome back to DM in the PM, the show that, for better or for worse, isn't near as sexually charged as that intro might suggest. My name's Tom Quinn, resident dungeon master here at Modern Myth, and today we are rounding out our series, the final video in the series that we call Building Blocks of a Campaign, and today's topic is structure. If you guys have found yourself at this video and you haven't watched the prior episodes in this series, I would highly recommend going back and watching those first, because this episode we're going to be talking about the way we can use structure as a template to inform our implementation of the other concepts that we've talked about so far in the series. With that said, let's dive right into it. Structure really is a template. And when I'm talking about structure in the context of Dungeons & Dragons, actually supersedes Dungeons & Dragons by really as long as we have been telling stories as a species, or certainly as long as we've been recording those stories. Now, structure can take many forms, and loosely speaking, effectively all we're talking about really is a beginning, a middle, and end, first, second, and third act. To be a little more specific, let's think about structure as if broken into 5 distinct components. And these components, when plotted, are best represented by an arc. So this would be the arc of a character's story, the arc of the story of an adventure, the arc of a single encounter, could be the arc of an entire campaign. And that already starts to give you intimations of how scalable this concept of structure is. And when we take that structure and start applying it to all these different facets of our game, it will begin to inform us of when we need to establish those motivations we talked about in the beginning, ways in which we can incentivize characters to move through these arcs, as well as implementing consequences within those arcs that could ultimately have a lot of weight on the way in which those individual story loops are playing out. Structure is also going to be a great template for us to use when it comes to deciding how we're going to use contrast to build tension and modulate pacing within the game space. So let's talk about the individual components that make up this structure, that build out this story arc, this narrative arc. And working chronologically through that space, naturally we need to start with an orientation. And an orientation is the phase of the story arc where we are introducing characters, we're introducing setting. For anyone who is running their own campaign worlds, this is session 1 in a nutshell. This is your opportunity through exposition, through those early interactions with your characters, where you're really beginning to give your players a sense of what is going on in the world that these adventures are going to be playing out in. Importantly, we're also going to be bringing about the introductions of those characters. That's both the protagonists and could well be introductions to some of the antagonists in the story. But in general, this initial phase, this kind of starting point, is effectively everything in the world is normal, or as normal as it's going to be given the context of the game space. And this is our opportunity to really begin to establish the relationships at the table between characters, both player characters, NPCs, any characters who are being introduced into that game space, any important setting features that are being introduced into that game space. All of that is being set up in the first component of structure, which is our orientation. The second component of narrative structure, which is rising action, is where we begin building tension in and we begin introducing conflict. And in order to build that tension, to allow those conflicts to play out, it's important that we have instantiated motivations in the game world that are contrary to those of our players. With our heroes being the protagonists of the story, it is our job to ensure that there's something they can do heroically. And generally, that means us instantiating a motivation in the world that is evil, fundamentally, or if not outright evil, is at least misaligned with the motivations of our party. As we move through that rising action, building more and more tension into a space, we eventually arrive at the apex, or the climax as far as narrative structure is concerned. And this is the place where we've capped out all the tension we can possibly or reasonably build into a given story arc. A couple of things tend to happen at the climax of that arc. We've reached our pinnacle of tension, but generally what will break that tension, what will provide a little release, is a solution is made apparent. That solution has not been implemented yet. And that could be something as simple as the final stand. We're standing off with the arch villain of this story, and we've come to realize he does, in fact, have a weakness. There is hope. We get that little sigh of relief, which I guess that might be a good way of thinking about it, is there is hope. And the more tension you build, the more cathartic that moment is of, holy crap, we might succeed here. We might survive. We might come out the other end of this still the heroes of this story. So as we hit the climax, we begin descending from there. And as we move from the climax into the falling action, this is really where those solutions begin to be implemented. Maybe your party has found that item that they've been searching for the last 3 levels of the campaign. Maybe your party has learned the means by which they can close the dark portal that has been menacing this half of the campaign world. Whatever the implementation is, this is the area where, through that catharsis, realizing there is a course of action and beginning to implement it. And there's a tremendous amount of pace in this space between the climax and the falling action. There's a huge amount to be said about pacing in this area here. Now, the resolution, which is the final component of our narrative structure, is the place in which the problems of that loop have been solved. The characters have been victorious or not. Certainly, there's nothing about this structure that demands that your players have been successful. But as we land in this space, something important I want to note about the resolution phase is, even though they have been successful or they have failed, the resolution that has occurred often can leave a space. We talked about the orientation being status quo for the area that the story's playing out in. The resolution, in many cases, even though we've kind of gone back to normal, in many cases after the arc has concluded, normal is a more complex version of what it was before. So you can kind of envision that arc raising up, and as it comes down into that falling action, the resolution actually sits a little bit higher. There's a little bit more residual tension just by nature of the increased complexity of the world given the events that have unfolded. And what's great about that is you can envision each one of these is kind of a rounded step where you start at the low point, work your way up into that climax, and as you slow it back down, you don't come all the way back down to where you started. And this is really useful when you're using small narrative loops chained together to work your way through the broader narrative loop, and that can scale out all the way to the kind of the grand final encounter, that overarching story that is playing out for the entirety of your campaign, with each of these smaller loops leaving what is considered normal a bit more complex, a bit more confused than perhaps it was before that loop started. And that's a great segue into scaling of structure. Scaling of structure ultimately is utilizing that same template at a varieties of different resolution, such that you can build really compelling story arcs, even into small encounters. There's no reason that this arc couldn't be applied to a combat encounter, for instance. As your players enter that space where combatants are prepared to engage them, we have stepped into the orientation phase of narrative structure. Many times you'll find that your players are asking questions that help them to orient themselves in that space. They want a sense of, what do the combatants look like? They need an introduction to these characters so that they have an idea of how they want to interact with them, what their motivations might be. And this is a great place to be able to build in that contrast of enemy types, contrast within those types of different kit, different armor, different weapons. It's a great place to inject motivation into those creatures. Perhaps they've walked into a space that at first glance definitely appears like it's going to be a combat encounter, and they come to find that you've completely subverted their motivations, because this band of trolls are more interested in parlaying with the group in exchange for maybe their own side quest. This is also a great space to consider consequence and incentive. If there's any way in which you want to modify the incentive structure or the consequences of this soon to ensue combat, this is a great place to be giving that consideration. As we move into that combat, we begin pushing into that rising action. We've introduced this band of trolls as existing in conflict to the party's desire to pass through this space unharmed. We begin building tension as initiative is rolled, and this is really the space where contrast begins to lend itself to how much tension, how rapidly are we building tension, how rapidly are we spooling up pace in this space. Perhaps these trolls are actually pretty timid, and by the time the first one gets knocked down, if the players brandish fire and acid, the other ones rapidly realize this fight's not for them. Conversely, these trolls could be emboldened by something, ratcheting that difficulty up and subsequently building more and more tension into this space. Whatever the case is, as we move through this rising action, we will eventually hit the apex, the climax of this arc, of this combat. And that climax is likely the moment where the party begins turning the tide. Perhaps they've never fought trolls before and they don't realize that fire and acid are going to be a necessary component in engaging with these enemies. A tremendous amount of tension begins building as their efforts to kill these things are in vain without the necessary components. We talked about that moment where we've hit the peak. The party's looking at it and going, we're exhausting resources. These things just keep coming at us no matter how hard we hit them. We slide into that falling action right on kind of the cusp. The transition between those two is that moment where the party realizes they found the solution. The mage happenstantially shoots off a firebolt and they come to realize, oh, fire is quite potent in this engagement. They have found a solution, and as we go into that falling action, they begin implementing it. Players dousing blades in oil and igniting them. The mage exhausting almost exclusively their pyromancy skills. And we begin to slide into a place where the solution that they found is implemented, and we're now in a space where the combat has resolved. So even though we've found that resolution, it is very likely that the world the players are standing in now is more complex than it was just moments ago before they had encountered these trolls. After all, they were intending to go do something else when they ran into this band of trolls. That's concerning. Who knows what's in the next room? A residual tension remains, as now we're moving out of a small narrative arc and we're using that as a building block into a series of narrative arcs that will make up this entire adventure, each one subsequently building a little more tension for that broader arc until ultimately we get to that climax and we work our way into the falling action and ultimately resolving this adventure. Now, that's an example of how structure can be really informative on that micro scale. In the combat example that we just went through, you can see how that narrative structure arc is going to lend itself to the next and the next and the next, each of these building upon one another and slowly building out this broader arc that will make up the entirety of, let's say, this module or this adventure. If you extrapolate that out far enough, eventually you get out to the world space, the broad overarching storyline, the overarching plot that is really driving your entire campaign. A really important consideration when we're thinking about narrative structure inside the D&D space is that we really can't cut corners in this capacity, or I should say, if we are cutting corners, it will be at the expense of your party's ability to engage in a compelling manner with that arc. A really good example of this might be our party has finally reached the end of this adventure. They have fought long and hard to arrive at the decrepit ancient temple. And as they fight their way down into the dungeon, they come to that final room where they're going to have that epic face-off. Standing before them, a diabolical warlock who they've never met before. They didn't even have intimations he was down here. This is literally the introduction. So what we've done is we have forced them into a space where we should be somewhere near the climax, but simultaneously that space is having to operate as the orientation for this arc. And you can see how disjunctured that might feel. Your players having done all the necessary legwork, following those incentives that you've laid out for them, driven through the world by their own motivations, only to arrive and for the first time meet the bad guy that they're supposed to be defeating. Now, there's nothing that says you can't do this. In fact, there may even be some narrative reasons why you would want to, but generally speaking, your players are going to get a lot more payoff when they finally strike down that villain if they've had a proper introduction, if there's been time for that villain to move through the rising action, taunting the players, foiling them throughout their attempts to track him down. All of the elements of that structure really needs to be built into any meaningful relationship within the game. And that could be something where these players maybe had their orientation with this character at level 2. And they're facing off with this character at level 12. I mean, it could be that big of a gap. And it's far better to have that expanse, have a drawn out, shallow curved arc than one that spikes super dramatically, because you really need time to build tension. So keep that in mind as you're introducing elements into the story that you want to have meaning to the party. If you do, you really need to take the time to give them a proper introduction, give those elements time to build tension, allow conflict to exist, because that builds importance in the characters' minds. That adds weight to these elements that you're bringing in. Conversely, if you've given a character, say a villain, a proper introduction, a proper orientation into the game space, you've gone to lengths of building tension with this character. The conflict that this character represents to the party is obvious. You've built this up, all the way to near that climax. If that character then never reappears into the story arc, you've effectively built up tension that you have no real lever to release for your characters. Now let's talk about narrative structure relative to our players, because it can be a really, really powerful thing to be able to tap into the structure, the arc, if you will, that their character is currently moving through. And that's not something that we always have control over. Again, we can incentivize, we can issue consequences, we are creating motivations in the world to hopefully move these players in meaningful ways. But ultimately, the way in which they're moving through that arc is in their hands. Now, if we can identify the way in which they are navigating their own respective arcs, that's really where we have opportunities to tie in elements from the broader campaign world to help reinforce where they are in the course of their own character arc. And this can be maybe the most powerful thing that you can do with regard to engaging with your players' stories. Being cognizant of the fact that your players are moving through many small narrative structures just as you are creating them in the world, and those small structures are ultimately making up the broader picture of their character arc. And recognizing where your players are currently in that arc will give you the ability to lend the necessary tension or ease that tension to really enhance the experience that they're going through on a character level. As a DM, it can be really easy when you're thinking about these broad conflicts playing out across perhaps the entire campaign setting to lose sight of the fact that the narrative structures, albeit much smaller, that are playing out for your characters, in many cases, they can be deceptively meaningful. A simple conversation, a sentimental moment, or a revelation about their character, in many cases, these types of interactions present really, really strong opportunities for us as DMs to kind of clear the space, clear the scene, so that something really meaningful can play out in a space that might otherwise get lost amidst all the noise of the conflict going on in the realm. So I would really urge everyone to take a look at what is transpiring through the characters in your party and find opportunities where you can. A lot of times you can kind of see them on the horizon, moments that you know are going to be meaningful for a character in some way or another. And that could be a big combat, facing down an old rival. But it could also be something a lot more subdued. It could be a character's return to their hometown that they haven't seen in decades, maybe. And it's pretty amazing when you have a moment that is meaningful to your player at the table. As a DM, if you clear the scene, if you give your players space to engage with those meaningful moments, however simple those moments may seem. I've been surprised on so many occasions by the weight with which a scene will play out between two players, or even a single player who is engaging with the world in a way that's meaningful to them, and something that we could have just breezed over as just quick exposition. You arrive in town, things aren't as you remember them. Taking the time to narratively build some tension in that space, describing their old home and how it's changed from the last time they were here, painting a picture of the wash of memories that are flooding over them as they move into this space. This is a great example of how we as DMs don't need to interject an explosion into every scene in order to keep things snappy. Some of the most meaningful and engaging role play that's taken place at my table has taken place in the spaces that oftentimes get shuffled past to make way for the next big fight, to make way for that fireball that comes streaking out of the sky, to usher in more and more of that tension. But don't allow that to overshadow the fact that there's these subtle moments that are playing out for each of your characters as they move through their individual arcs. Take the time to make space for that to play out at your table. You'll be surprised at how much your players will reward you for doing so. Keeping structure in mind and really using it as a template to provide you those indicators for when maybe is the time to start pushing tension into a space, when is the time to provide that release, and more than anything, to really just take the time to allow a structure to develop, to allow that arc to play out. I think one of the most damaging things that you can do with regard to presenting a compelling narrative is to try and rush this process. Your players really do need an opportunity to get to know the world around them, to get to know the other entities that are in the game space, and to get to know each other. Tension takes time to build. Conflict takes time to build. And the more you allow that tension to build, the more payoff you get when you finally get that exhale. I really do hope that this gives everyone out there something to think about as they're writing their own game worlds, as they're moving through their own game spaces. And really, I think this is just a call to take a breath yourself, slow things down, and leave the space necessary, leave the time necessary for these stories to develop. Because if you allow this structure to play out, if you allow those steps or allow your players to move through those steps, by the time you get to the end of the arc, they have ended that narrative with something meaningful, and now they're prepared to step into the next one. And with every one of those that unfolds within your game world, the space gets more complex, it gets richer, it gets more enjoyable to be in for your players, and that can carry you all the way through to the end of whatever awesome stories you guys are telling at your own tables. That just about does it for me, guys. Thank you so much for joining me for this video, and thank you so much for joining me for the entire series. I do hope that everything in this series just gave you something to chew on. I know that this is a pretty high level, kind of a 30,000 foot view at a lot of these concepts. And in future videos, we'll go a lot more in depth on kind of individual components, encounter building, session prep, behind the DM screen, these types of things. But if you have an inherent interest in telling stories, and I have to imagine that's at least part of the reason why you find yourself sitting in that DM chair, then all of the principles that we've talked about throughout the Building Blocks of a Campaign series really are, I think, a pretty solid bedrock for thinking about building stories into the game space, into the world of Dungeons and Dragons. As I said before, I really hope that this gave you guys something to think about. I would love to hear in the comments all your thoughts on structure, all your thoughts on pacing, your thoughts on anything to do with the series. Like I said, keep them coming. I love engaging with those. I love hearing what you guys have to say. Beyond that, we hugely appreciate it. If you got anything out of this conversation, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, click that little bell so that you don't miss anything coming down the pipeline from us here at DM in the PM, and that goes for the broader Modern Myth family as well. Thank you guys so much for joining me for this series. I look forward to seeing you next time here on DM in the PM. But until then, the world is yours.